copycat, cheater, rat, and you are? Okay, well, we all have heard this in our childhood. But what about we do the same thing in chess? At the beginner level or at the amateur level, we often see the players mimicking each other. Whatever white does, black usually mimic it. In today's chess video, I'm going to share with you how you can mimic, copy your opponent, annoy him till the time that you get a solid position. This is a tricky opening against 1 e4, but it is solid at the same time. In most of the games, you might also get the winning position. You might win a piece or a pawn, or you will have a winning advantage. So without wasting time, let's get started. It starts with 1 e4, and as black, as we are going to respond, we'll play our pawn to e5. When they play the knight to f3 attacking our e5 pawn, we do the same thing. We play our knight to f6 attacking their e4 pawn. Now this is called as the Russian game or the Petrov defense. We are not going to go for the classical variation. We are going to see how you can get a winning position out of it. So if he captures on the e5 square with his knight, you do the same thing, you capture on e4. And now there's a very famous trap here that the queen comes to e2, and if you try to move your knight away anywhere, let's say on the f6 square, then knight c6 comes with a discovery. It attacks the queen and the queen gives a check. So you cannot save the queen. So most common move from white side is to play the queen to e2. Now since we are trying to annoy him, mimic him, don't play your knight back. Just play your queen to e7. If he captures your knight, you are going to get this knight back. Right now, don't mimic, because if you do that, you are going to lose the queen. But what can we do? We can give an attack to him. We can play our pawn to d6 and attack the knight. If the knight goes back, then the queen is lost. The knight is pinned to the queen. What if he tries to defend it? He plays his pawn to d4. The time he does that, we are going to capture the knight and he is going to capture it back with the d pawn. Now here, you guys might think we have just blundered a pawn for nothing. We are a pawn down in this position and we don't have an advantage as well. But this pawn will always be vulnerable. You're going to regain it anytime. Right now you're attacking it with the queen. He's defending it with his queen. You can play your knight to c6 and attack him further. Now there are thousands of ways how white can defend this. The most common is they play their bishop to f4. The time they play their bishop to f4, then we can go with our pawn to g5. This looks tricky, but we don't want to castle on the king side. We are aiming to castle on the queen side. So opening up the file or moving the pawns in front of the king side is fine. You play g5. He cannot capture it. If he goes back, then you are going to win this pawn. The bishop goes back, then you are going to win the pawn. And if the bishop tries to protect the pawn on the e5 and goes back on the b3 square, well then comes an interesting move. You can play a pawn to f5 and attack the queen. Notice that he cannot do an opposite here because the queen is hanging. So he'll have to move the queen. Let's say he saves his queen somewhere on a4. Then you can just play a pawn to f4 and out of nowhere you're winning a bishop. See, I said you annoy him and you're going to win a piece. So that's how you can win a piece. He capture, you capture back, and any time this pawn is a free pawn for you, you can regain it and you will be a complete piece up in this position. Okay, so this was when he defended the pawn with his bishop. Let's say he is defending it with the pawn. So what if he plays his pawn to f4? That doesn't change anything. We are still going to go with our bishop to g4, develop a piece thanks to the queen that has already moved. So you can now castle and get the rook on the open file, aiming for this d1 square as well. Here, if he tries to do a normal developing move, trying to pin your knight, play the bishop to b5, then you just ignore the threat. There's nothing happening. You just castle because now you have renewed the threat to go on the d1 square. It will be the check. The king will have to move and you're going to win the rook. So that is a very good thing for you. Now here, if he tries to block that file or block the square by playing his bishop to d2, then you can anytime go with your knight to d4. This attacks the bishop and your next idea is to get this bishop on the f5 square, attack the queen. Eventually you can fork him and win the rook. So there are a lot of ideas for black how black can win this position. Okay. Coming down to what if he is not playing his bishop to d2, instead he is simply castling. Castling is also a good option that defends the threat of rook coming on the d1 square. Also knight to d4 will not that be feasible for black to do. So what if he castles? After he castles, now you can go with your queen to c5, give a check and attack the bishop. So it's a fork, a double attack. You're attacking the king as well as the bishop and you are going to win a piece again. Right? Okay. Moving back few moves, this was when he plays his pawn to f4. Now let's have a look. How about he just completely ignores that pawn, he does something else. He's like, let me give my pawn, but I'll focus on the development and directly go with his bishop to b5, pinning your knight. So then you can defend it by playing the bishop to d7. Now if he castle, you can also castle on the queen side. The queen was already developed, so you can castle on the queen side. Now after few normal developing moves, you can get a winning position. Let's see how. You give an attack to the bishop. If the bishop goes back on the a4 square, then you are simply going to capture the pawn. That was a free pawn. And now after all the pieces gets exchanged, you as black have a comfortable position. Look at all your pieces aiming in the center and they are well placed. If the rook tries to exchange it, you first go bishop f6. The idea for bishop f6 is to attack this diagonal. The knight went on the b6 square to go on c4 and you are aiming for b2 pawn, and overall black is going to have a winning position here. Okay, so this was when the bishop went back on the a4 square. What if the bishop simply captures the knight on the c6 square? Well, that is also bad for white, because now when he captures on c6, you can capture it back with the bishop, attack the queen, and look at this bishop. It is a complete active bishop on that diagonal, and you will have a winning position or an advantage in this position as well. So this was also, notice one thing over here. What if he's not playing knight c3 and this time now he tries to defend it with the bishop to f4, thinking that all the other threats are gone. But you can do the same thing. Whenever the bishop comes to f4, you give him an attack, he goes back, you play a pawn to f5. Notice that this is already a pin, so he cannot oppose or do anything about it, and you are going to win the bishop eventually. So this was all when we see that he was trying to... Going back to few moves, let's see what if he defends it with the d4 square, the knight, but this time instead of capturing the pawn on e5 with his pawn, he is aiming for an queen exchange. So we are fine with the queen exchange as well, because this pawn on the e5 square will always be our target. It is a weak pawn and we can target it. Now you can give an attack to that pawn on e5 by playing your knight to c6. If he defends it by playing his pawn to f4, then you can simply play a bishop to f5, giving another threat, attacking the pawn on the c2 square. If he defends that by playing his pawn to c3, then you can simply castle. And now you know the rook is on the d file, the bishop is going to jump in over here and you will have a very good position. Also, if you want to, he know that you are going to go bishop c5 and he'll play his bishop to e3, let's say, then you can first play a pawn to g5. Now these pawns are good here, right? You just want to mine them, and if he captures it, you can first capture it back, and then the g5 pawn. Also, you are aiming to open the files up. So now here, if he tries to maintain the pawn chain, you capture back, and then you have an option of playing your bishop to h6, attacking his pawn. Then if he plays a normal looking move, a normal developing move, let's say knight to d2, then you can win this pawn back with your knight just by capturing on the e5 square, taking the advantage of this tactical motive, that it's a pin, and he cannot capture it. He is going to lose the bishop there, or at least we are going to win the pawn. Okay. Overall, you see, this is such a solid opening. Whatever white does, it is an error, or you will at least have a good position. Now coming back to the original position, what if here he is not going with the queen to e2, instead he is going with the queen to f3? That is also not a problem for us, because now our knight is in danger and we can simply come back with the knight. Play our knight to f6. What can he do? He can play his bishop to c4, now aiming for this f7 square twice. So that also fails to pawn to d5. Many of the players, the second most common move here is they capture the pawn, thinking that if you are going to capture it with the knight, then it's a checkmate. But they hardly forget that, funnily enough, they forget that you can capture it with the queen too. So that will exchange the queen and you will have a good position again here as black. That is a piece up. Okay, what if he's not capturing it and he is going back? So if he goes back, then you can simply attack the knight and take advantage of your development in this position. So you see how good this opening is for black if you do. So now coming down to one final line, what if he is not trying to capture your pawn on the e5 square, instead he is defending his pawn on e4 by playing the knight to c3? Well, we are going to mimic him. We are going to play our knight to c6 and defend our pawn on e5 as well. Now here, if he does a normal move like bishop c4, aiming for the f7 square and developing a piece so that he's preparing his king to castle, here there's an interesting idea that you can do is you can capture on the e4 square with your knight. Not sacrificing a knight. It is actually getting it back in the center right there. So now this gives a fork and you are going to win your piece back with some good pawn structure in the center. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share with your friends. I'll see you again in the next video.